You won't believe what you're about to see when you dive into the world of locomotives. These aren't your ordinary trains. These are monsters of steel, giants that once ruled the rails, hauling incredible loads, defying geology, and doing things you didn't even know a train could do. Today we're going to explore the biggest locomotives ever built that you didn't even know existed. By the end, you'll be forced to rethink just how enormous and powerful a train can get. Imagine standing next to something that measures over 130 feet long, weighs more than 500 tons, and can pull thousands of tons up steep mountain grades. That's not sci-fi. That's the legacy of some of these incredible machines. And we've picked three of the most extraordinary examples: a steam giant, a diesel colossus, and a lesser-known European beast that pushed the boundaries in its own way. So strap in, because we're going on a journey through raw power, record-smashing size, and unforgettable engineering. You'll learn about the design, the mission, the wild features, and what's left of them today. And trust me, the next one is even stranger than the one before. Let's begin with our first chapter. We travel back to the early 1940s in the United States. The war is raging, trains are hauling everything: supplies, troops, materials. And on the railroads, one company needed a locomotive that could handle monster freight trains through mountain ranges. Enter the beast known as the Union Pacific Big Boy, one of the largest steam locomotives ever built. Background context. The Union Pacific Railroad had long struggled with heavy freight trains over steep grades, particularly the Wasatch Mountains between Ogden, Utah and Green River, Wyoming. The existing locomotives simply weren't enough. So between 1941 and 1944, the American Locomotive Company built 25 big boy units exclusively for Union Pacific. Unique features or surprising facts. They measured roughly 132 feet, about 40 meters long, with their tender, and weighed more than 600 tons. Their wheel arrangement was 4-8-8-4, 4 leading wheels, 2 sets of 8 driving wheels, and 4 trailing wheels. Their tractive effort, pulling power, reached up to 135 375 lb force, according to Guinness. They were powerful enough to haul 3,600 short-ton trains unassisted up steep grades. Why it mattered, what made it special. In a time when freight was king and the United States war effort and economy depended on big loads and efficient rail service, the Big Boy represented the pinnacle of steam-era power. It was the ultra-heavy haul weapon of its time, designed to conquer terrain that lesser machines couldn't. It symbolized engineering pushing to the edge, and it carried freight and materials through places that were extremely challenging. Legacy or fun fact. Of the original 25 Big Boys, several survive today as static displays, and one, number 4014, was restored to operational condition in recent years, making it still one of the largest mainline steam locomotives in working order. If you ever visit Cheyenne, Wyoming, or other railroad museums, you might face one in person and feel just how massive these beasts really were. Transition. But if you thought that was as big as it gets, hang on. Next we move from steam to diesel, and the next one is even stranger. Twice the engine, one frame, a massive length and horsepower built for a completely different era. You don't want to miss it. Now we're into the diesel era. As steam faded, railroads looked to replace the monsters with diesel-electric machines. And in the late 1960s, one railroad decided to go all in. Meet the EMD DDA-40X Centennial, the largest and most powerful single-frame diesel locomotive ever built. Background context: the Union Pacific Railroad again needed raw power. In 1969, the company celebrated the centennial of the first transcontinental railroad, the Golden Spike event of 1869. They commissioned EMD to build something huge. A locomotive with 2 16-cylinder diesel prime movers on one frame, delivering 6,600 horsepower. But unique features or surprising facts. It was 98 feet 5 inches long, the longest diesel ever built for a single unit. It weighed about 545,000 lb, roughly 247 metric tons in some configurations. It carried 2 full diesel engines, 8 traction motors, a massive fuel tank, 8,000 plus gallons. It was called Centennial because of that 100-year celebration. Why it mattered, what made it special. At a time when railroads sought to haul heavier freight, faster over long distances, this locomotive represented the extreme of the diesel age. By putting 2 engines on one frame, UP reduced the need for multiple units and tried to simplify operations, at least in theory. It represented the transition. Big power, fewer machines, less crew. It also marked the end of an era of make the beast bigger in many ways. Legacy or fun fact: while 47 of these were built between 1969 and 1971, most were retired by the mid-1980s. But at least one, UP6936, DDA40X, number 6936, remains preserved operational with the railroading heritage of Midwest America, RRHMA, and occasionally still runs special excursions. Also, this design introduced modular electronics and other features that fed into later locomotive generations. Transition. So we've seen the biggest steamers, the biggest diesels, but there's yet another story. A lesser-known giant from Europe that might surprise you, because largest doesn't always mean most famous. We travel now to Europe in the 1910s and 1920s, to the MAV Class 601 of Hungary, sometimes nicknamed the Giant. Not usually the first locomotive people mention when thinking of largest, but it stands out for its time and place. Background context: built between 1914 and 1921 by Mavag in Budapest, these mallet-type articulated steam locomotives were designed for extremely heavy freight service over steep grades. They weighed in at about 163 tons with tender, in-service mass. That may sound less than the big boy, but given the era and the terrain, it was a remarkable machine. Unique features or surprising facts: they used the mallet articulated design, which means part of the locomotive pivots so it can better handle curves, especially on mountain lines. They had compound cylinders, 4 cylinders, 2 high pressure and 2 low pressure, and were built to haul long, heavy cargo trains on steep mountain lines like from Karlstad, today Karlovac, Croatia, to Fiume, today Rijeka, Croatia. Also interesting, they lacked any survivors. None of the MAV Class 601 locomotives remain intact today. Why it mattered, what made it special. In the European context of the early 20th century, when many lines were narrow gauge or had sharp curves, the Class 601 showed what could be done with steam when pushed to its limits. Heavy freight, steep gradients, and the articulation allowed it to function where a rigid frame wouldn't. It was among the most powerful in its region and era. Legacy or fun fact: although none survive today, their memory lives on as one of the largest and most ambitious European steam locomotive classes. If you dig into European rail history, you'll find reference to the Class 601 Gigant on steep mountain freight duties. It's a reminder that giant locomotives weren't just an American story. Now let's head somewhere you probably didn't expect: the Soviet Union. You've heard about the big boy, sure, but did you know that the USSR built a locomotive so massive that it looked like something straight out of science fiction? Meet the AA21, the largest steam locomotive ever built in Europe, and one of the strangest ever created anywhere. Picture this. It's 1934. Stalin's industrial empire is booming, and engineers are told to design a locomotive so powerful it could haul enormous loads across the vast plains of Russia without the need for double-heading or banking engines. So they built the A21, the world's only 414-4 locomotive. That means it had 14 driving wheels, the most ever placed on a single rigid frame. When you first see a photo of it, you might think it's fake. The thing is absurdly long. The boiler stretched endlessly. The driving rods looked like mechanical snakes. And even the engineers at the time joked that it looked more like a rolling bridge than a train. But here's the twist. While it looked unstoppable, it didn't really work that well. The design was too extreme. Because of its 14 driving wheels and rigid frame, it couldn't handle curves. The Soviet tracks just weren't made for it. On straight sections it was a monster, but try taking a corner, and it practically tore up the rails. It was meant to haul coal and freight across flat terrain, but even on those stretches it struggled with poor balance and heavy axle loads that damaged the track. The poor AA21 was powerful, yes, but almost useless. It became a cautionary tale of what happens when you design for size over practicality. Still, it holds the record. It's the largest rigid-frame steam locomotive ever built. Only one was made, and after a short, problematic career, it was scrapped in 1960. But its legacy? It became a legend, a kind of myth among train enthusiasts, because it showed that even in failure, pushing boundaries can lead to incredible feats of imagination. And if you think that's wild, wait till you see what comes next. A locomotive so big it wasn't even one machine. It was two locomotives permanently joined together, designed to conquer Australia's endless, dusty outback. Meet the Garrett locomotives, and in particular, the Garrett AT60 class used in Australia. Now, if you've never seen a Garrett before, it looks like something out of a steampunk fantasy. A huge central boiler suspended between two separate sets of wheels and engines. It's like a train with its own built-in helper engines at both ends. The AT60 class, introduced in the 1950s, was a monster, even by Garrett standards. It was about 108 feet long and weighed 265 tons in working order. Imagine that crawling along the tracks through the Australian wilderness, pulling hundreds of coal wagons through mountains and valleys. What made it special was the way it solved an old problem: how to build a huge, powerful locomotive that could still handle curves. By splitting the machinery into two engine units connected by a flexible frame, the Garrett could navigate tight curves and steep grades that would have destroyed a rigid frame locomotive like the A21. And here's the fun part: these beasts looked like living creatures when they moved. Because the ends articulated independently, the front and rear would almost crawl around curves while the boiler stayed steady in the middle. Standing near one, you'd see the whole train writhing like some kind of iron serpent. The AT60s worked mainly in New South Wales, hauling heavy coal and freight. Their pulling power was incredible, up to 2,000 tons, and for a while they were the pride of Australian rail. But by the 1970s, diesel power arrived, and the giants were gradually phased out. Still, one survives. Locomotive number 6229, lovingly restored and operating in Canberra today. If you ever see it in action, the sound alone will make your jaw drop. It's like hearing thunder roll down the track. Now here's where things get even more interesting. So far we've talked about size in terms of weight and length, but what about raw power? Because the next locomotive didn't just break records, it destroyed them. Enter the modern era, and the Union Pacific gas turbine electric locomotive, also called the Big Blow. Even the nickname sounds menacing. These beasts were built in the 1950s and 60s, when engineers decided to experiment with aircraft technology, literally putting jet engines inside locomotives. No, that's not an exaggeration. These locomotives were powered by turbine engines similar to what you'd find on an airplane. The result? Power output of up to 8,500 horsepower, unheard of for their time. Each one stretched about 181 feet long when counting both sections. They were so loud that towns along the Union Pacific main line complained, because it sounded like a jet plane was passing through every few hours. That's how they earned the name Big Blow. Why build something so wild? Simple. Union Pacific needed something to move enormous freight trains across the vast American West, especially through desert areas where long stretches of straight track made high-speed hauling ideal. Gas turbines offered a ton of power for relatively low maintenance, at least on paper. But as with most experiments, reality was complicated. The turbines guzzled fuel, and when oil prices spiked in the early 1970s, the Big Blows became too expensive to run. By 1970, they were all retired. Still, during their peak, they represented the height of post-war innovation, a bridge between the romance of steam and the modern efficiency of diesel-electric. Fun fact, one of these monsters, number 26, is preserved at the Utah State Railroad Museum, and if you stand next to it, you can see why it was nicknamed a jet on wheels. So far, you've seen steam giants, diesel beasts, articulated monsters, and turbine hybrids, each one showing that engineers across the world shared the same dream: more power, more capacity, more ambition. But hold on, there's one more locomotive that might just beat them all in modern power. Meet the Siemens Vectron Dual Mode Max and GE AC6000CW, modern-day locomotives that quietly dwarf even some of those earlier legends in sheer performance. The GE AC6000CW, for example, built in the late 1990s, boasted 6,000 horsepower from a single diesel engine, a record for decades. It was designed for the heaviest freight trains in North America, and while it didn't have the same size as a big boy, its technology and pulling force made it one of the most advanced locomotives of its era. Meanwhile, the Siemens Vectron Dual Mode Max, a newer European locomotive, might not look huge, but under its sleek body lies next-generation engineering: 7,000 horsepower, digital traction control, and the ability to switch seamlessly between diesel and electric power. It's the modern answer to a century-old question: how to move more with less, and that brings us to the real question: what's the limit? If humans can build gas turbine trains, articulated steam monsters, and computer-controlled diesel powerhouses, what's next? Maybe maglevs and hydrogen trains will be tomorrow's giants. Not heavier, but smarter.